So once again, good morning, everyone. My name is Zarina Varukatty, and I'm the president of the Women's International Forum, and I'm from Singapore. A warm welcome to WIF's final event of the season, and we are very, very honored today to have with us as our speaker, Dr. Richard Haas, president of the Council on Foreign Relations. So thank you very much, Dr. Haas, for accepting our invitation. Since this is the last event of the season for us, and since we do have some new members of the diplomatic community who are with us today, please allow me to say a few words about WIF. WIF was founded in 1975 with the aim of providing a forum for briefings and discussions on international issues to promote understanding and mutual appreciation among members of the diplomatic community and members of the New York community. And we strive to share knowledge, raise awareness about current international issues, and to uphold the principles of the United Nations Charter. And we have been able to do what we do for the past 46 years only because of the support from our members, both from the New York community as well as the diplomatic community. So a very big thank you to all of you on behalf of the executive board of WIF. We very much hope that you will renew your membership for our next season, which starts in September. We will be sending out an email about membership renewal in the next few days, so please do look out for it. Now, turning to today's topic, the title of our Fireside chat is Challenges of Globalisation in an Age of Disinformation. So the format today is a fireside chat. Before that, I would like to call upon Mrs. Tina Kunjul from Mauritius, who is Vice President of WIF, to introduce Dr. Haas. Tina?
Welcome, Dr. Haas. Dr. Haas is a believer in diplomacy, in multilateralism, and in the institutions. He is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 18th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations. The council was founded in 1921, and it is an independent American, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and an educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. In 2013, Dr. Haas served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haas was the Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he directed the policy planning staff and was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the US Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haas also served as a US coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and as the US Special Envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. For his efforts to peace and conflict resolution, Dr. Haas was the recipient of the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. He has also received the Presidential Citizens Medal and the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. Besides his extensive experience in government, Dr. Haas is also the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and 1 book on management. His latest book, The World, A Brief Introduction, is a New York Times bestseller, as well as an editor's choice selection and a staff pick. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Haas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina, for the introduction. As I told Dr. Haas earlier, I have read his book, The World, A Brief Introduction. As a student of political science and a former diplomat, I found it very fascinating. So I wanted to start off this fireside chat, if you don't mind, Dr. Haas, following up on some of the things that I found very fascinating in your book. One of the things you say is that social media promotes narrowcasting, allowing users to follow only others who share a similar worldview. In such instances, users come across only information that confirms their existing beliefs and are not challenged to hear the opposing side and grapple with new or different information. Really like to hear your thoughts on how much of this has affected the ability of the United States to play a leading role in the world, and will this change?
Well, thank you, Zarina, but I'll only answer that and other questions if you start calling me Richard. We've got to be even here. So if I'm going to use a first name, you have to use a first name.
Okay,
I want to
promise.
thank you. And I want to thank Tina as well, and really everyone in this group, the WIF, both for today, but also being part of a group like this. It's great to see. It's a little bit odd to have a fireside chat as summer begins. Though I should point out, when Richard Nixon was president in the Oval Office, he used to have a fire going all year round. He was not, he never stopped for July or August. You can make of that what you will. It's a busy time right now. We will not have a shortage of subjects to talk about, given what's going on literally right now in Geneva and what's going on the last week. So a busy time. Look, in terms of social media, it is the world of narrowcasting. When I grew up 400 years ago, in the United States, there were 3 television networks, and there wasn't such a thing as the internet. So there were a lot of newspapers, and what this provided for was 2 things. One was a lot of common experience. So the next day at the water cooler at work, there was a pretty good chance that everybody would have watched one of the 3 nightly news shows, for example, or one of the morning shows before they came to work. And these shows were highly produced and edited, or to use the expression, they were gatekeepers. There was fact checking and a certain assurance of quality. Well, now, 50 years later, none of that's true. We've got a proliferation of cable channels, a proliferation of AM radio, FM radio, and satellite radio. We've had the birth of the internet and essentially the unlimited proliferation of sites, and everyone now, if you think about Twitter and Facebook, any individual can become his or her own site. We're all publishers now. We're all editors now. We're all authors now, but there's no quality control. And I don't know about your computer, but mine doesn't come with little yellow pieces of paper that says, this is accurate, this is inaccurate. It's not like a medicine bottle or a pack of cigarettes that has those warning labels. Probably the internet, maybe it should come with warning labels, but it doesn't. And all of this is taking place against the backdrop in the United States, where the quality of our education is wildly uneven. And many Americans are not learning the basics of their own history. They're not learning the basics of what's going on in the world. And so to me, it's not surprising that a lot of these sites, which are peddling misinformation or conspiracy theories, are gaining a lot of traction and having a lot of influence. And the bottom line is, yes, it makes it extraordinarily hard to conduct democracy. And Thomas Jefferson used to say that one of the prerequisites for successful democracy was that there be an informed citizenry. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. Only informed citizens are in a position to hold elected representatives to account, to ask the right questions and so forth. So to me, it's a real concern. And I can quite honestly voice the concern more than I can articulate an answer to it in terms of how does one regulate social media, a real problem. But I do think one of the real challenges in the United States, and it's actually it's the lead story in today's New York Post. One of my guilty pleasures as a New Yorker is I read the New York Post. But it's about parents protesting the lack of quality in public education. And that is one of our real challenges in America. Think about it. The only thing every American does now is he or she has to go to school until the age of 16. After that, there's virtually no common experience. But one of our failures, I would argue, is that the common experience of access to education is not sufficiently common. That the quality, the education that too many Americans are being exposed to is truly inadequate, either to prepare them for a modern economy or to make them informed citizens. And that is, if we don't fix that, we will continue to, I believe, see American democracy challenged from within.
Thank you for that remarks, and I think those are very valid observations as far as democracy is concerned. But just to play the devil's advocate, do you think that you know, in the globalized world that we live today, do you think that Americans would change their ways if they learned more, if they knew more? Could it be that many Americans, wary of draining overseas commitments and anxious about to concentrate on problems close at home, might weigh the costs and benefits of global activism and still wouldn't want America to be as engaged as it was before in the world stage?
Look, it's a fair question. Simply being informed about the world doesn't automatically result in certain policies. But I would, I guess, put it this way, Zarina, if Americans are uninformed about the world and why the world matters, it's almost guaranteed they will not support an active foreign policy. They will be de facto isolationists because they won't understand or see the connections about how the world affects their lives. But if Americans understand why the world matters, if Americans understand how American foreign policy in turn affects the world, we won't have consensus. Even within the foreign policy community, there have been and are tremendous differences about what ought to be the priorities of American foreign policy. Should we use military force in this situation? And again, there's no consensus, and there never has been a complete consensus. So, but it does seem to me that having people understand the basics of the world increases the odds, one, that we will be more involved in the world, and two, we'll have a more thoughtful debate about our policy options.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful too, and you know, we in Asia, and I speak for Singapore, we value American involvement and leadership in the region and in the world. So we really certainly hope that you know, America continues to be engaged from what we've seen in the past 1 year after the Biden administration. The other thing that came to my mind as you were talking about the social media and the internet is when we say that there's a lot of misinformation out there, it has a very negative connotation of how technology has facilitated this access to information. However, one can also say that technology has democratized the marketplace of ideas and influence and empowered the younger generation, whereby we see the Greta Thunberg phenomenon. And for me, that is a very positive development. How do you think technology can be harnessed positively?
Well, look, the first thing to say about technology is it's neither inherently good or bad. It's both. Nuclear weapons are terribly destructive, but nuclear weapons also are the largest single explanation that the Cold War stayed cold.
Absolutely.
Technology has just saved millions of lives in these vaccines, but technology can be a threat so technology to me is just a reality, and that's true of history. And you know, the printing press was a great breakthrough. Now, some of the things that are printed can be really destructive. Mein Kampf was made possible by the printing press, but so too were a lot of valuable things. So that seems to me inevitable, that almost like Newton, for every action there's a positive and negative. And I think that's the case with and the challenge. One way to think about public policy, or one way to think about international relations, is how do we harness the good parts of technology and how do we regulate or restrict the bad. So take one area, nuclear. the whole idea of the Non-Proliferation Treaty was to make nuclear power, nuclear energy available at the same time that we tried to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. So that was an explicit attempt to harness the good side and restrict the bad side of a particular technology. We've been, shall we say, only partially successful. And I think it's too bad that nuclear energy is not more popular than it is, because it obviously has zero carbon footprint. But that's another conversation. But we've had only limited or incomplete success, shall we say, stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. We were just talking about the internet. The internet can be a fantastic highway for the free spread of ideas and information. It can facilitate investment, business, but, and there's an enormous then long list of buts. There's some terrible things about and so again, it's that's the challenge. It's how do we encourage the good flows? How do we restrict the bad ones? And I think that's true of just about every aspect of globalization, or just about every aspect of modern life.
Very true. I know that our participants will have a lot of questions for you. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then I will open it up to the participants. Sure. So just an administrative note. So if you would like to ask a question, please indicate it in the chat function, indicate your names, and then I will call you and you can ask the questions yourself. Remember to unmute yourself when you ask the questions. Thank you. So my last question relates to what you evoked earlier on when you spoke about what's going on. So many things going on today in the world as well as the UN. You mentioned the meeting in Geneva, and I think that's going to be, everyone is looking at that to see what's going to come out of it, or at least what is going to be said publicly. But one of the interesting things was the piece in New York Times this morning that talked about how cybersecurity has, displaced nuclear conflict as one of the most important issues to be dealt with, and some analysts have said that a digital Geneva Convention limiting the use of cyber weapons against civilians, would be a good thing. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it actually follows on perfectly from what you just asked me. Basically, again, cyberspace can be a very positive tool. Yeah. But what we've also seen is it can be it potentially could be a weapon of mass destruction. If you target a dam, if you target a nuclear power plant, you can cause enormous loss of life, or a hospital. Same thing. So again, it's a perfect example of technology. The problem with cyberspace is it's grown up. It's become incredibly important to economies, to societies, to militaries. But the two things: one is the technology is advancing very quickly. It's changing very quickly. And secondly, it has far outpaced diplomacy. We have almost no diplomacy in cyberspace. Think about it. The analogy I use, which it's an American one, so I apologize, but you've all seen cowboy movies. It's like the American Wild West 150 years ago. And you have a lot of guys on horses all shooting their guns. And there's not a lot of law, and there's no sheriff. That's cyberspace.
I agree. Yeah.
And so I'm skeptical of being able to come up with what you call a digital Geneva Convention, in part because there's no consensus about what ought to be the rules.
Yes.
Obviously, authoritarian regimes have very different views about the free flow of information than others. And then secondly, even if there were rules, I worry about our ability to enforce them. What would happen if one of these groups, so-called non-state actor, were to do something and a government would say, well, we had nothing to do with that. This is an independent group. We didn't know about it. We couldn't stop it. So again, to somehow deter these actions, to shut them down, I actually think it's far, far, far more difficult than nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons, they're only potentially in the hands of a few. Cyberspace is so decentralized, it's so invisible, it's very hard to attribute anything to anyone. So I actually think the challenges of introducing a degree of order here are enormous. And so I haven't given up. And I actually think it's a big challenge for people who do what I do for a living, to at least come up with some foundation of rules. But at the moment, again, the technology is way, way, way ahead of the diplomacy. There's no equivalent. There's no real equivalent of arms control, or what you call a Geneva Convention here. And the question is, can we design one? And then two, can we get one in which the governments of the world, and in some cases non-governments, would abide by it? Big challenge.
Yeah, big challenge indeed. And I believe the United Nations is undertaking some work to come up with some kind of framework to address some of these issues. So, but even if, whether it's a challenge or not, it is a field that has to be addressed, and it's an area that really needs to come under regulation.
100%. And I think the first step, whether it's through the UN or through institutions like mine, the Council on Foreign Relations, is to at least come up with, what do we think is a desirable architecture? What would be a desirable, to use the academic word, regime, set of arrangements? Then we can begin the process of seeing where we can get buy-in from the part of governments and others, what we would introduce in the way of discipline, enforcement. But the first question is, what does the architecture look like? And that's something that could and should be designed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I see many people who put up their hands to ask questions. I'm going to first call on Tina, who has a question for you.
Okay.
Tina, please.
I see Tina right in the middle there. Got you.
Hi, Richard. I've got a couple, if you don't mind. If you wouldn't mind saying another couple of sentences about the Council on Foreign Relations. For us who don't know much, I did say a little bit in the introduction. I have as an American and as representing a small island, I wanted to ask you, last week Boris Johnson said that President Biden was a breath of fresh air. And when the president won the election, the mayor of Paris said, "Welcome back, America." What is your response to those leaders and others who say, well, for how long?
Okay, well, I'll take your second question first. I don't have an answer to that. And when others look at the United States now, how do I put it? They are uncertain as to what represents what you might call the new normal and what represents the aberration. And to put it bluntly, the last 4 years of Mr. Trump, were those simply an aberration? And after roughly 70 years of fairly, relatively consistent policy, with, even though there were changes, more continuity than change, Democrats and Republicans alike, beginning with Truman. And Mr. Biden represents a return, or what's sometimes called a restoration. Or did Mr. Trump represent the harbinger of the future? And Mr. Biden then becomes a temporary aberration from what's this new phase of America? I don't have the answer to that. I would simply, and I can't answer it simply because I don't know what the future of the Republican Party will be. I was a Republican for 40 years. I am no longer a Republican as of about a year ago. This is not a Republican Party I recognize. And I worked for 3 Republican presidents as well as 1 Democratic president. And also there's parts of the Democratic Party that would take that party in a very different direction as well. I'm referring to the progressives. So I think in some ways the future of American politics, the question of is there an American center? Again, for the last 70 years, even though we've had political rotation, Republicans to Democrats, Democrats to Republicans, there was actually a significant degree, again, of commonality and continuity. I think we've reached a point in American political history where that's no longer true within or between the parties. And that introduces a great variable or great dimension of uncertainty. And I think it's truly unhelpful, I'll use a diplomatic word, for our foreign policy, because it introduces a significant degree of unpredictability to what it is we're going to do or say. Not just where we are now. I could sugarcoat it, but that just has the advantage of being true. And I think for other governments, they've got to take that into account. That as they look at the United States, as they gauge their own situation, their security and other, they've got to basically say, okay, well, we used to have something that we considered to be, if not a constant, close to a constant, and now we don't. So others have to think about how they adjust or not, or hedge or not against this change in America. In terms of myself, the Council of Foreign Relations was created 100 years ago. Interestingly enough, in a situation a little bit like our own. It was right after a great pandemic, the flu, and horrific. And it was at a time of a considerable debate in the United States, in this case after World War I, about to what extent ought the United States remain engaged in the world. Powerful forces of isolationism. The United States, as you recall, did not join the League of Nations. Senate rejected it. And I actually think that situation is in some ways analogous now, that not just the pandemic, but a very broad debate about what our relationship with the world ought to be, how much foreign policy we ought to have, how unilateralist or multilateralist we ought to be, should our goals in the world be, for example, to shape the foreign policies of others as opposed to promote democracy and human rights. Big debates. So and the Council on Foreign Relations was created by a bunch basically of men in New York, Washington, and Boston to have what they called a continuing conversation about these issues. They were, by definition, internationalists. They were anti-isolationism. And this has been going on for 100 years. We're nonpartisan, Democrats, Republicans, and others alike. We don't take a penny of money from any government. We're truly independent. We publish the leading magazine in the world, Foreign Affairs. We hold probably 1,000 meetings a year. Today, I'm hosting Lord Stern, who's probably one of the leading experts in the world on climate. I'm doing him in a few hours. And then later today, I'm hosting the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. So we'll be doing that. We're also, what's really new about us is, in addition to all the meetings, we have a think tank, fellows writing books and articles. We publish the magazine. We've got the websites. We've become an educational institution. In some ways, parallel to my book, what we've decided is we had to try to fill the gap in American education, whether it's for high school students or college students or Americans at any age, that we are going to become a force for global education. And if you go on our website, cfr.org, you'll see something called World 101. It's an entire free curriculum, an introduction to the world. We've got something called Model Diplomacy. I would bet, by the way, every one of your countries is using us. Our educational materials are being used in something like 115 countries around the world. They're being used in all 50 states. And that's part of our mission, is we want to be a resource, not just for people who have chosen to be part of the foreign policy, international relations debate, but we want to try to get people into that debate, into that conversation, so we become an educational institution.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very important work that you do at the Council on Foreign Relations. Just to repeat, it's cfr.org if you want to go to their website. Like Richard says, there's a treasure trove of many papers and information on what's going on in the world. We have next Tracy Tokuhama Espinoza, who is also a board member. I'd like to call on Tracy to ask a question.
Thank you so much. And what a wonderful conversation. And I've just put two and two together when I was in university at BU and doing international relations. That was required reading, was foreign affairs. And I didn't realize it came out of your office, but wonderful reading. Thank you. I wanted to return to education and just ask your thoughts on some tools for policy. When we talk about, the United States is one of the few countries probably in this Zoom call that doesn't have a real centralized structure for education. Our Department for Education plays kind of dressy role, but when Pashi Salzberg of Finnish Lessons spoke, he made the point that there's like 50 different systems that we're working with. So it's very hard to have this overarching vision. And so I was thinking of maybe three options, and or four. I'm sure you have thought of many more than I, but I would just like to hear your thoughts on either an expanded role at the Department of Education level to sort of string all of these pieces together to have some kind of an impact on public education. That was kind of like a la E.D. Hirsch in the 1980s, trying to have some kind of cultural literacy or something that was shared. Or another role, Salzberg pointed out that Salzberg mentioned that because of the way we finance public education, the taxing system, rich, communities have better teachers, and that's it. So is it a tax reform question? A third idea would have to be with, when you were talking about cyberspace, it just occurred to me, all of the lack of regulation of things about shared or common use of internet and access and digital literacy that's happening a lot throughout Europe, but we're not doing so much here. So just wondering what other tools you see for maybe trying to coalesce all of these very different states. I'm originally from California. Here I am now in New York. I just see so much. My freshman year, I drove across country just to see what was in the middle, just to figure out, what's different. And we're so different. So how do you bring all that together and an appreciation for all the lessons we can learn from all the other countries? What other tools would you think about to try to even out that disparity in public school systems in the States?
I've got a lot of ideas, but I'm not sure any of them are politically viable. You're right. I mean, for those who aren't familiar with our educational system, the federal government has almost no say in it. Education is a local phenomenon. And it could be at the state level or even below the state level, county or state or city or what have you. Most of American public education is financed by local real estate taxes, which again, and the problem is, therefore, in terms of our civics, there's no curriculum that every American is exposed to. And I think this is it's both a cause and a reflection of the problem. The idea that someone in Florida would learn something different than someone in New York or California or Ohio about the Constitution and about American political history seems to me incredibly corrosive. But there are a few things more controversial than the idea of national standards. You just can't get it. It's very hard to get from here to there. So I can understand why at the state level you might teach different things about state history. But the last I checked, there's only one national history. There's only one Constitution. And indeed, we went to the Constitution because a state-centered political system under the Articles of Confederation was woefully inadequate. Yet there we are. And then the way we finance education, again, I mentioned a minute ago, the piece in the New York Post today, what we see is an enormous discrepancy. And what's so dangerous about that is this is a country that is premised on the idea of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. But then we have to make sure those opportunities are really equal. The best way to make sure that opportunity is equal in the United States is education. Because again, that's something that's widely available. If public education is not sufficiently good, so equal opportunity is a reality rather than simply a slogan, then people will either demand much more government intervention in the society, or they will start taking untraditional, outside the system approaches, some of which could be potentially destructive or even increase the inequality. which is exactly what's happening. So I don't have the solutions here. And it's the reason that we've produced at the Council of Foreign Relations all this free material. It's the reason, I think you're also seeing a much broader private effort to make publicly available and broadly available civics materials, groups like iCivics and others. But we've got a real crisis in this country of the quality and availability of education. Our teacher training is deeply uneven and in many cases widely flawed, particularly at the high school level. The university level, the reason I wrote this book is at virtually any school in the country, what is offered is good. The problem is virtually nothing is required. So you can, it's like going into a supermarket. You can go to this shelf or buy that cereal. That's the way we approach college education. You can buy this cereal, but ignore that cereal. Well, it's very hard then to get a foundation of awareness or exposure or capability. So we've got a deeply, deeply flawed educational system. I would say if there's, and when I think of what I want to do with the rest of my life, I won't stay at the Council on Foreign Relations forever. I will probably devote my spare calories to education, because I do think still, as flawed as it is, and as difficult as it is to reform, I can think of no potentially better vehicle for addressing a lot of these challenges in in American society. And I think if you took a step back and you look at our political divisions, you looked at a lot of things that are wrong in this country, you can try to fix them directly. But to me, what's so powerful about education potentially is it's the best indirect approach over time to creating an environment or a context in which the political system could usefully address a lot of these ills. So I keep coming back to it, but at the moment it's not positioned for the sorts of things you're suggesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I do tend to agree with you. And I think a lot of people will agree with you that education is really where you can start to, make changes and impact on how the future generation makes decisions, not just for domestic, but also international issues. So I'm going to ask a question on an international issue that was sent to me by one of our board members, Pamela Jakowicz, and I will read her question.
Hey, Pamela. I've known her forever. I used to be the U.S. envoy for the Cyprus dispute. So I worked with Andrew and got to know Pamela. This was, 40 years ago. And needless to say, I did not succeed.
Yes, Pamela does fondly remember you. And I asked her to come on, but would you like to ask the question, Pamela?
No, I'm not good on Zoom, but hello, Richard. It's wonderful to see you.
Thank you.
Right. So her question is, with the new government in Israel, how do you see prospects for peace in the Middle East?
Well, I think you have to, when you say peace in the Middle East, subdivide it. If you mean progress in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's impossible to be optimistic. You've got a coalition in Israel that is not built to negotiate peace with the Palestinians. It was built to defeat Bibi Netanyahu. If you look at the Palestinians, you've got Hamas controlling Gaza, which does not recognize the Jewish state. And you've got a leadership in the so-called occupied territories, the Palestinian Authority, that is too weak to be a capable negotiating partner. So you don't have what I would call the preconditions of diplomatic success, or the word I would use is ripeness, R-I-P-E-N-E-S-S. You just don't have it. So I think all you can do is try to keep open options for such a time as you might have different leadership in place, and think about what you could say or do that might encourage the emergence of such leadership. But at the moment, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he could buy an apartment in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. He could spend 24/7 doing nothing but pushing this, and he wouldn't get anywhere because he just doesn't have the pieces to work with. In the broader Middle East, I would look. You've got the terrible situations in Syria, in Libya, and elsewhere. And then you've got I think the immediate challenges posed by Iran, its nuclear program, and as well as other things it's doing. So I don't see any prospects for quote unquote Middle East peace in the broader sense. The most you could hope for is in Yemen, Libya, Syria. Had there be any progress in any of them? I don't know. It's hard to be an optimist at the moment. And the question is, what can you do about the Iranian nuclear program and other aspects of Iranian behavior? So, but I don't see, again, the Middle East has been and is, and I'm sorry to say, will be, I believe, the most troubled part of the world. And I just don't see that changing for the foreseeable future. Sorry to be so negative, but you didn't ask me to sugarcoat things, so there you have it.
Thank you
for
very
the
much, Richard.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you. I think you have answered with that one other question that was posed by Nella Habsburg. And I think Betty Robbins' question on education was also addressed earlier when you spoke, when you addressed Tracy's question. We have next question from Lina Fernandez from Colombia.
Yes, thank you, Zarina. Yeah, I would like to bring probably another part of the world to our discussion. And Dr. Haas, thank you for being with us. So what's your reading of Biden's foreign policy towards Latin American region? And don't you think that the US should probably play a more active role now that we see that the region is probably walking opposite direction from globalization ideas and democracy ideas, at least as I know them? So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you. I'm worried. I'll be honest with you. I am worried about trends in your part of the, I'm worried about some trends in your country. Colombia has made extraordinary progress. The partnership between the United States and Colombia was remarkable, I thought. And the progress made there was, and I see that to some extent in peril, but I see what just happened in Peru. I see what's going on in Mexico, Brazil. Look, we now have a populist wave. You asked what the United States is doing about it or going to about it. The answer is not enough. I'll be blunt. One of the problems this administration has, it's not a problem, but it doesn't have much in the way of a trade policy. There's no consensus in the Democratic Party on trade, a lot of opposition to trade, growing opposition in the Republican Party to trade. And so I would love to see a serious trade initiative for the Americans. I would like to see the United States in the CPTPP and RCEP, but I don't see any of this happen. But I worry about that. I think vaccines. We've been too slow to make vaccines available. One of the reasons Peru voted the way it did is because of a lack of vaccines. And I think because what's happening, and one of the reasons also we have some of the migration pressures we have, is a lot of these countries are still suffering terribly from COVID. And as a result, what's opened up is an enormous economic gap between the American economy and local economies. Well, people are reacting the way people react when there's that kind of an economic gap. If we're growing at 6 or 8% and they're shrinking at 6 or 8%, not surprisingly, they're going to think about migrating. If they've also got to deal with weak governments that can't provide security, they're going to think about migrating, and that's what's happening. So I actually think we need a much more ambitious policy towards the Americas in the short run with vaccines. We need a trade policy. And what happened with Colombia, I think, ought to be a model where we ought to help governments build capacity so governments can provide the security that governments owe their citizens. So I actually think we need much more American foreign policy in the Americas. What I can't do is sit here and tell you it's coming. I don't know. I'm worried. I don't see it. The priority for this administration is clearly Asia and China. But what we've seen, and what we're seeing on the border is you can choose your priorities, but sometimes your priorities choose you. And so maybe that'll be something of a wake-up call. And maybe we will see a little bit more focus on the Americas. But I worry about the trend. I feel Latin America over the last 25 years, there was so much progress, not just in Chile, Colombia, Brazil, other countries. And I worry that a lot of that progress, Mexico also, is being now put in jeopardy.
Mhm.
I worry, Latin America goes through cycles, and it had a really good cycle, more democratic, better economic standards for a lot of people. And I worry now that we're in a kind of populist wave. And I worry about the consequences for the region. And so, yes, I think we ought to be doing more to partner with countries in your part of the world. But so far, at least, I haven't seen it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you, Richard. We have like almost 10 minutes, but we have a lot more questions. But I will try and call as many people as we can.
I will try to be.
accommodate.
I apologize for my long-winded answer. Lo siento mucho.
But so I would just like to make a request that please keep your questions succinct so that many more people can ask questions. We have Leonardo Castillo, if you would like to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Just a quick point. Thanks for the invitation to the Women's International Forum. As a feminist and a husband to my wife, I'm happy to be here with you. Dr. Haas, I just wanted to drill a bit more on how one foreign policy issue, human rights, and how it sits in the swing of the bipartisan pendulum. Many people argue that human rights is a bipartisan issue, but there is a clear variation between Democrats and Republican administrations. And I'm sorry to hijack this question because it's an opportunity for me since I'm looking into my PhD research on foreign policy, including the US. So any couple of pearls of wisdom would be very appreciated. Thank you.
I actually don't think it divides neatly between Republicans and Democrats. We've had Republicans historically, like, say, Ronald Reagan, who pushed human rights very hard. And we've had Democrats like Jimmy Carter and others. So I don't think it neatly falls into one camp or the other. And again, both parties are evolving in any case. I think the real question for human rights, democracy, rule of law is one, how much of a priority should it be? And the problem with making it a priority is in many cases is two. One is we may want to see the world as more democratic, more respectful of the rule of law, but often we lack the influence. You're about to see that carried out. We'll think about the meeting going on in Geneva right now. We want to see a Russia that doesn't arrest its political opponents. Well, I don't think we're in a position to bring that about. We don't like what the Chinese are doing in Hong Kong or Xinjiang. It's not clear to me we have influence. So there's that. We don't like the coup in Myanmar. So far, we've been powerless to reverse it. And then secondly, in places like Russia or China, we have concerns about human rights, the rule of law, and the rest, but we've also got other concerns about nuclear weapons, about North Korea, about Iran, about security. And the question is, how do you manage the trade-offs? You can't say, well, we're not going to have a relationship with you in all these other areas because we disagree with you about human rights. We don't have that luxury. And we've got to deal with both. So the reality is we've got limited influence. Countries can resist what we want. Mr. Putin or Xi Jinping don't share our views about how to best organize a society or a political system. And we can't put all of our eggs in that basket. We've got other eggs to put in other baskets in these relationships. I also think right now we've got problems here at home. So with all due respect, our ability to promote human rights, the best way for the United States to promote democracy is to show that American democracy is working well. If people see a democracy here and an economy here and a society here that are succeeding, they will respect it, and they'll want to import that. They'll want to emulate that. But when they see things like January 6th, or they see a Congress that can't agree on much of anything, when they see the amount of gun violence we have or opioid death we have or what have you, America loses, I think, its ability to be a powerful influence. So I think that is, I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And I still think that is true. It doesn't end at home, but it does begin at home.
Excellent answer, Richard. I'm a big fan of yours, and I think you really put the issue in context. And yes, and we always were told that foreign policy begins at home when we think about issues in the foreign ministry or even at home. Thank you for that. We have 5 more minutes, and I would, if you allow me, I'd like to allow one more question maybe. I think Elena had put up her hand earlier. If you would like to ask a question, please unmute your microphone.
It's Elena Todd, ex-Pico. So I knew you with my first husband. And no, I going back to education, I found everything you said is right. But my point is that is the lack of judgment. That is, we have a lot of that, and that's a problem. And I find, having gone through different education in different countries, that educating your mind to judge what is right or wrong, even in a translation from ancient Greek, helps you judge always in your life what is right or wrong or in between. But is the judgment in the mind of these young people that I find is absolutely missing, because they follow. They don't judge. And I would like to know what we could do to help them. And having a granddaughter now, I'm terrified of seeing what's going on even in their wonderful school. So I would like to ask you, what is your idea? I mean, it's.
Well, look, I struggle with that also. Look, I think in education, you have on one hand content. Judgment, though, is something else. So let's put content aside. We can argue what ought to be the content of an education, the substance. But things like critical thinking, what constitutes good judgment, that's something else. And that's something in part you can teach. There are certain techniques about what's the difference between a fact and an opinion.
Yeah.
You can teach that, and you could say what place, how do you know where to go for something that's more authoritative than not. You can learn the law school and other places you teach critical thinking. But I would think a liberal arts education, every person who comes out of it ought to be better at this question of critical thinking, expression, know something about collaboration. But then you get into something else also in a democracy, which is character. It's not just a question of good intellectual judgment as a kind of intellectual exercise. My view is a lot of people probably know better, but aren't acting on it. And that's a question of character. That's not a question of judgment. Like I've heard things in the last 48 hours, just when I think I can't be surprised anymore, I'm surprised. And I heard certain statements. I mean, I run a nonpartisan institution, but I'll mention it. I was very unhappy with the statements of the Republican leader in the Senate about his refusal to approve potentially judicial nominations put forth by President Biden, and basically say, and that to me, I mean, you get into something called norms. So democracies succeed not simply because of laws. Laws only take you so far. At some area in every democracy, at some point, we encounter norms, and norms get into human behavior. They are, somebody once described character as what you do when people aren't looking, when it's not being noticed. Character or norms are about not what you have to do, but what you should do or not do. And so the question is, how do you promote that in a society? And I don't know if that's the role of universities or high schools or elementary schools, if that's the role of a family, if that's the role of religious institutions. But so it's not, all I'm saying is what you're getting at. It's not simply a mental processing issue in order to come up with rigorous analysis and conclusions, though that's part of it, and to distinguish between facts and opinions and so forth, to question information. But also there's a character issue here. And I think that's a real challenge, because classrooms are not well equipped to teach character. We tend to look to dinner tables or religious institutions or other groupings in society to teach that. And the question is, what do we do when those aren't performing what it is needed from them? And I think in some ways we're paying a price for it now.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, adding to the list of institutions that you mentioned, it could also be a civics program or military service that brings everyone in the country together.
Absolutely.
I mean,
No,
yeah.
I would love to see some form of national service, not military, but national service in
National
this country.
service.
In part, we have too many Americans from too many walks of lives who don't have anything in common anymore.
Absolutely.
And I think it would be
Absolutely.
really one of the help. Anyhow, there are other societies where you have it, and I think it would be helpful for this one. We're becoming way too separate in where we live and how we live and where we get our information and the rest.
Absolutely.
And it's bad for a society.
We have an 18-year-old who went back to Singapore to do his military service, and I can't tell you what a transformative experience has been in just 1 year. So, you know, before the kids go off to college, they absolutely should do some kind of national service, like you say. Well, we are now at 11:02, and I'm so mindful of taking your time, Richard, because I know that you have so many important, between the Prime Minister of New Zealand or Ireland.
Today is New Zealand.
New Zealand, yes. And so many other commitments today. So I just want to thank you very much on behalf of the Women's International Forum Executive Board and all the members present here for your time and for your insightful comments. And I also would like to encourage everyone to read Richard's latest book. It can be your summer reading and easy to bring wherever you go. Is pretty light. Or go to the Council on Foreign Relations website to get further information on the issues that we discussed and evoked today. So once again, thank you, Richard. Wish you all the best and have a great summer.
Thank you, Zarina. Thank you all. Stay safe and well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.